It was meant to be the happiest day of her life. The flowers were perfect, her dress stunning, and her groom waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes. But as the vows were about to begin, someone in the back row stood up, her ex-boyfriend, holding a gun. What happened next would turn a celebration into a blood-soaked nightmare, one that would scar a small town forever. This is the story of Ella Jennings, her wedding day, and the man who couldn't let her go. The morning of May 14th dawned with a kind of gentle golden light that made everything seem like a dream. Birds sang softly through the trees surrounding Willow Creek Chapel, and a light breeze carried the scent of spring flowers across the lawn. Inside the whitewashed wooden structure, rows of carefully placed chairs were adorned with ivory sashes and tiny sprigs of baby's breath. It was supposed to be the happiest day of Ella Jennings' life. Ella, a 27-year-old nurse with warm hazel eyes and soft auburn hair, had grown up in the quiet town of Bedford, Ohio. Known for her kindness and resilience, she had faced life's trials with grace. Her father, who had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, was determined to walk her down the aisle. That morning, he sat beside her in her dressing room, eyes filled with emotion. Though visibly frail, he whispered, "We made it, sweetheart." Ella smiled, trying not to let the tears smudge her makeup. She wore a lace wedding gown with a sweetheart neckline, her long veil pinned delicately into her curls. Her best friends bustled around her, offering last-minute touch-ups and encouragement. Outside, guests began arriving. The groom, Nathan Hale, stood at the altar in a tailored Navy suit. A local firefighter, Nathan was well-liked, admired for both his bravery and quiet sincerity. His fellow firefighters filled two of the front pews, their uniforms crisp, faces beaming with pride. Ella and Nathan had met at a community fundraiser just over a year earlier. Their connection had been immediate. He had steadied her during a time of emotional wreckage. She was just 6 weeks out of a long, painful breakup with Ryan Mercer, a relationship many in town had assumed would end in marriage. But where Ryan had been possessive and stormy, Nathan was dependable, calm, and patient. Though their romance had been swift, it had also been genuine. In 8 months, Nathan proposed beneath the old oak tree behind Ella's childhood home. Her father cried. Her mother cheered. Even her friends, initially skeptical of the timeline, agreed that Nathan brought Ella peace. Still, one person remained disturbingly silent about the engagement. Ryan Mercer. Ella hadn't heard from her ex in over 6 months, at least not directly. There had been rumors. Sightings of him sitting in his car outside her hospital, strange messages from untraceable burner accounts on her social media, and her friends receiving anonymous calls asking about her wedding date. She had brushed it off, telling herself he was probably just moving on in his own way. But Ryan wasn't moving on. He was spiraling. After their breakup, he had lost his job in real estate, moved back into his mother's basement, and begun a downward slide into paranoia. He fixated on Ella's new life with Nathan. His online search history, later recovered by authorities, was filled with dark questions. What happens if you interrupt a wedding? Can heartbreak cause violence? And even, fastest way to make someone pay? Unbeknownst to anyone, he had been watching. That morning, as guests parked their cars and took selfies beside the chapel, a dark sedan pulled up across the street. The man inside wore a pressed black suit, sunglasses, and a gray baseball cap pulled low. He clutched a gift box, but inside wasn't a present. It was a loaded Glock 19. Ryan sat in the car for 20 minutes, heart thudding in his chest, watching as Ella stepped out of the bridal suite, radiant and glowing. He saw her father lift her veil and kiss her forehead. He saw her mother crying happy tears. His grip tightened around the handle of the gun. When the wedding march began to play and the guests rose to their feet, Ryan made his move. He slipped through the side entrance of the chapel unnoticed. With expert precision, he moved into the last pew, sitting quietly as the music swelled. His eyes never left Ella. As she stepped closer to the altar, Nathan reached out for her hands. The officiant smiled, his voice rising above the soft rustle of dresses and shuffling feet. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union." Then he asked the question, "If anyone objects to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." A single voice broke the silence. "Yeah, I do." Heads turned. The crowd murmured. Nathan looked puzzled. Ella froze. Ryan stood up slowly, removing his sunglasses. Gasps echoed around the room. Some recognized him immediately. Then came the scream. Ryan lifted the gun. In the split second before the shot rang out, Nathan lunged forward, trying to protect Ella. The first bullet tore through the air. Chaos erupted. Time fractured into chaos. 1 second, a wedding. The next, an ambush. As the initial shot echoed through the small chapel, the guests erupted into screams. Panic set in like a contagious disease, a wave of shrieking, stumbling bodies scrambling to escape. The bullet struck Nathan in the chest. He collapsed instantly, his body hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. Blood began to pool beneath him. Ella screamed, a sound that cut through every other noise. Tara, Ella's cousin, rushed toward Nathan, but Ryan fired again. This time, a guest seated on the edge pew, a 60-year-old family friend named Martin Royce, was hit in the neck. He slumped sideways, lifeless. Bridesmaids ducked behind chairs. Guests trampled one another in the mad dash toward the exits. The officiant hit the ground, crawling for cover. A child sobbed in the back row. Ryan moved forward, eyes locked on Ella. She couldn't move. Her legs refused. Her gaze was fixed on Nathan's still form. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Tara, bleeding from a grazing wound in her thigh, dragged Ella by the arm. "We have to go. Now." They escaped through the side door, hiding in the bushes behind the chapel. Ella's hand shook uncontrollably. Blood smeared across her gown from Nathan's final touch. Inside, 2 off-duty officers among the guests tackled Ryan just as he raised the gun again. A brutal scuffle ensued. The weapon discharged once more, missing everyone, before it was kicked away. Police arrived moments later. Ryan was restrained and arrested, his expression unreadable. Outside, paramedic pronounced Nathan and Martin dead at the scene. Ella collapsed in Tara's arms, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. The dream had ended in gunfire, and her future, once so certain, had been stolen in an instant. The hours following the shooting were a blur of sirens, blood-stained satin, and echoing sobs. Ella sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, her wedding dress soaked in Nathan's blood and torn at the hem from the mad dash through the chapel garden. The soft lace that once symbolized joy now clung to her like a burial shroud. She stared at her trembling hands, red-streaked and lifeless in her lap. They had once held Nathan's. Only hours ago, those hands had clutched his with nervous excitement, ready to promise a lifetime. Now they held nothing but silence. Nathan was gone. The paramedic's voice faded in and out as he checked her vitals. She couldn't process his words. Everything sounded muffled, distant, like her soul had retreated somewhere deep and unreachable. Her eyes locked on the stretcher being wheeled past her. A white sheet covered the body beneath it, but she knew those shoulders. She had memorized them. Countless mornings waking up beside him. That soft scar near his collarbone, the one from a fire rescue 2 years ago. Gone. The sheet fluttered in the wind, and she looked away. Beside her, Tara sat quietly, a tourniquet around her thigh and dried blood on her palms. "They are taking him to the coroner's office," she whispered hoarsely. "Ella, he didn't feel pain. It was instant." Ella didn't respond. Her throat burned from screaming. Her body ached from tension and trauma. But her mind, the part that kept showing her Nathan's face, his smile, his outstretched hand, refused to shut off. Reporters began to gather beyond the yellow tape. Police cars blocked off the chapel. Crime scene techs moved methodically through the stained pews. Her bouquet lay on the floor, Crushed, a single lily bent backward, petals clinging to a small pool of blood. The press had already dubbed it the Wedding Day Massacre, a title so grotesque it made Ella sick. Inside the chapel, the horror still lingered. Guests sat wrapped in blankets, giving statements to officers with blank stares. Martin Royce's wife wept into the arms of a church volunteer. Children were being comforted with juice boxes and trembling smiles. But for Ella, time had stopped entirely. She was taken to the hospital for evaluation that evening. As they wheeled her through the emergency room, nurses looked up and fell silent. A few recognized her. Some gasped. Others whispered. Her white gown, now crimson and gray, dragged behind her like the ghost of a life she no longer lived. In the hospital room, she refused to change out of the dress. "Let me just stay in it," she said to the nurse. "You sure?" the woman asked gently. Ella nodded. "He didn't get to see me in it properly. He should have seen me in it longer." The nurse said nothing. She closed the door softly behind her. That night, Ella didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, blinking through tears that never fully dried. Her mother stayed in a chair by the window, eyes puffy and red, reading Psalm 23 under her breath, over and over. In her mind, Ella replayed every moment. The aisle, Nathan's face, the sound of Ryan's voice, the gunshot, over and over. And then came the guilt. What if she had called off the wedding? What if she had pressed charges when Ryan stalked her the first time? What if she had never dated him at all? The weight of those thoughts sank deep, and with them came a crushing truth. Love had not saved her. It had cost her everything. The next day, Bedford mourned. Candles flickered outside Willow Creek Chapel. Notes and flowers piled up by the gates. Nathan's firefighter colleague draped his turnout gear over the back of Engine 12 and stood vigil through the night. They remembered his laugh, his courage, the time he carried a child from a burning building and cried in private afterward. Ella watched the news coverage from her hospital bed. A photo of her and Nathan from their engagement party appeared on the screen, both smiling, bathed in golden sunset light, unaware of the storm that waited ahead. Then they showed Ryan Mercer's mugshot. His face was blank, empty, the eyes of a man who had lost control long ago. He had been transferred to a high-security facility and charged with 2 counts of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and multiple weapons violations. They said he showed no remorse. Ella felt none toward him. She wasn't capable of rage yet. Just a hollow sadness so vast, it stretched through every part of her. By the 3rd day, Ella was released from the hospital. She returned to her apartment, a place now frozen in time. Wedding decorations still adorned the walls. Her veil lay folded on the sofa. Fridge magnets held up photos of her and Nathan on hiking trips, at family dinners, under fireworks. His jacket still hung by the door. She stood in the middle of the living room, hands at her sides, and screamed. A deep, guttural scream that emptied her lungs and soul. Afterward, she fell to her knees and sobbed until no sound came out. Nathan's funeral was held a week later. Hundreds attended. The fire department organized a full honors ceremony. His casket was draped in an American flag, and bagpipes played Amazing Grace as his fellow firefighters saluted. Ella stood by his casket in a black dress, her fingers trailing over the polished wood. "I was supposed to be your wife," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Nathan. I'm so sorry I brought this on us." She placed her wedding ring beside him. She had kept it all this time, on a silver chain around her neck. As the casket lowered into the ground, she finally allowed herself to cry in front of others. Her father, now wheelchair-bound from illness, held her hand tightly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Martin Royce was buried the same day in a quieter service nearby. Ella attended that one too. She owed it to him. His widow hugged her without blame, only sorrow. 2 lives taken, dozens more scarred. The town would recover, slowly. But Ella? She wasn't sure she ever would. She began seeing a trauma therapist twice a week. She started journaling, writing letters to Nathan every night. Sometimes she spoke to him aloud, pretending he was just in the other room. Weeks passed, then months. The flowers people sent began to wilt. The messages stopped coming. The world moved on. But Ella remained in that moment, under the church rafters, holding Nathan's hands, right before the world fell apart. That's where she still lived, and she didn't know if she'd ever leave. Justice is supposed to bring closure. But what does closure mean when the one you loved is never coming back? The trial began 8 months after the tragedy, on a frigid January morning in Cuyahoga County Court. Snow dusted the courthouse steps like powdered salt, masking the cold brutality of what was to come inside. Ella Jennings sat in the second row of the courtroom gallery, her figure stiff beneath a black wool coat. Her hair, once rich auburn, now held strands of silver. She hadn't dyed it since the funeral. The world had moved forward. News cycles had changed. But for Ella, time remained stuck on May 14th. Her wedding day. The day Nathan died. The day Ryan Mercer turned love into a grave. Now, as she stared at the man sitting across the room at the defense table, the room seemed smaller, suffocating. Ryan wore a charcoal suit and no emotion. His hair was shorter, and his once lean face had grown pale in jail. Still, his eyes, those same eyes that once told her she was everything, remained cold and unreadable. Judge Martha Klein, a seasoned woman with decades on the bench, presided over the case. The people versus Ryan Mercer, the bailiff announced. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like fog. Ryan was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, unlawful possession of a firearm, and several counts of endangerment. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jenna Cruz, aimed to prove premeditation, that Ryan had not snapped in a moment of madness but had deliberately orchestrated the horror of that day. The trial was public. National media flooded the courthouse. Ella had asked for cameras to be barred, and the judge had agreed. Still, the world watched through headlines. ADA Cruz stood with firm resolve. This was not a crime of passion. This was a man who, after being rejected, chose to destroy not only the woman he claimed to love, but anyone who stood in the way of his control. She walked the jury through the evidence. Ryan's browser history, the burner accounts used to harass Ella's friends, the rental records of the vehicle he drove to the wedding, and the handgun traced back to an illegal purchase weeks before the shooting. The defense attorney, Gregory Wiles, took a different approach. Mr. Mercer suffered a mental breakdown. What happened was tragic, but not premeditated. He was under emotional duress and lacked the capacity to form intent. Ella clenched her fists. Every part of her rejected that explanation. She had heard the voicemail Ryan left her that morning, his voice eerily calm. "You'll understand when you see it all," he said. Over the following weeks, the courtroom became a theater of grief. Tara hobbled to the stand, still limping slightly from her injury. Her voice cracked as she recounted dragging Ella out of the chapel. "I looked into his eyes," she said. "He wasn't lost. He was focused." A forensic analyst detailed the ballistics of the Glock 19, confirming that Nathan had been shot directly through the heart at close range. Martin Royce's wound was shown in graphic diagrams, unavoidable for the jury, unforgettable for Ella. Nathan's fellow firefighter, Caleb Monroe, gave a statement about who Nathan was: a rescuer, a leader, a friend who never hesitated in a crisis. He died protecting the woman he loved, Caleb said, voice trembling. Even in the end, he acted like a hero. Ella was called to testify on day 14. Her heart pounded as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Sitting in the witness box, the courtroom became silent, as if everyone collectively held their breath. She described her relationship with Ryan, how it had begun with flowers and compliments, and slowly turned into manipulation and fear. She spoke of the stalking, The late-night calls, the sense that he was always watching even after they ended things. "I had hoped he'd move on," she said softly, "but a part of me always feared he wouldn't." She detailed the wedding day, how Ryan's voice cut through the chapel, how Nathan had stepped forward to shield her, how the gunfire shattered everything. "I remember the sound of the bullet," she whispered, "and the way Nathan's body dropped. I remember the blood on his shirt and how I couldn't stop screaming." When the defense cross-examined her, they tried to suggest her breakup with Ryan had been abrupt, that she had underestimated his mental state. Ella's voice turned steel. "You don't get to excuse murder because someone was sad they got left behind." The courtroom murmured. Even the judge seemed to pause. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Every second felt like a year. Ella sat in the hallway, staring at a vending machine without seeing it. Tara held her hand. Her mother sat nearby, prayer beads tangled in her fingers. Finally, the courtroom doors opened. "All rise," the bailiff said. The jury filed in. The 4 women, a middle-aged woman in glasses, held the slip of paper tightly. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the second count, guilty. Attempted murder, guilty. Unlawful possession, guilty. Ryan showed no reaction. He stood motionless as the judge read the sentence. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Ella exhaled. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was an ending. A door finally closed. As the courtroom cleared, Ella remained in her seat. Outside the window, snow still fell, soft, white, quiet. The pain hadn't gone away. It never would. But justice, in its cold and imperfect way, had been served. Later that week, Ella visited Nathan's grave for the first time since the trial. She brought fresh lilies, his favorite. She knelt beside the headstone, tracing his name with her fingers. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I told the truth. And I survived." The wind rustled the leaves in the trees above. The cemetery was still, peaceful. As she stood and walked away, she didn't look back. Nathan was with her now, in memory, in the silence between footsteps, in the parts of her heart that still beat despite the cracks. When someone you love becomes a memory, the silence they leave behind becomes deafening. The seasons in Bedford had changed, but Ella Jennings still walked through life as though suspended between moments, caught somewhere between the past and whatever remained of the future. It had been over a year since the chapel shooting. A year since Nathan's blood had stained her wedding dress. A year since she'd last heard his voice, felt the warmth of his touch, or seen that crooked smile he reserved just for her. But time hadn't healed anything. It had only carved deeper etchings of grief into her bones. Nathan's funeral had been a blur, a cascade of eulogies and weeping, the town gathering like broken glass around a family he left behind. His firefighter colleagues folded the American flag with trembling hands. His parents wept into Ella's shoulders, and she had stood there like stone, numb, shattered, emptied. She hadn't worn black that day. She wore the same shade of pale blue Nathan once had made her eyes look like ocean glass. It was the only tribute she felt strong enough to offer. By the 1-year mark, Ella had left her job at the hospital for good. She could no longer work in rooms where she'd once saved others but failed to save the one who mattered most. She took freelance work illustrating children's books instead, quiet, private job she could do at home. Her world had grown smaller by choice. She moved again, this time into a cottage just outside Bedford. The house sat near the edge of a forest, with a creek running behind the yard, and a small garden Nathan had once dreamed of growing tomatoes in. She had never told anyone that. It was one of their secret conversations on a rainy Tuesday, back when they thought they had decades ahead. Now, the tomato plants grew for him. Max, the dog she'd adopted after the trial, became her daily tether to sanity. He would nuzzle her hands whenever she stared too long at Nathan's photos. He guarded the front door every night, as though protecting her from nightmares that still slipped in through the cracks. But some things couldn't be guarded against. Every night, Ella lit a single candle before bed and whispered, "Good night, my love," into the dark. It was a ritual that kept her soul from completely unraveling. Tara had made a remarkable recovery from her injuries. She now led a support network for survivors of domestic and public violence. She frequently encouraged Ella to speak to the group, to share her story, to turn her pain into purpose. But Ella wasn't ready. Her pain didn't want a microphone. It didn't want headlines. It just wanted to grieve. "I'm proud of you," Tara said one night as they sat on Ella's porch sipping tea. "You survived something most people couldn't bear." Ella looked down at the cup in her hand. "But I didn't really survive. Not all of me." Tara nodded. "Then let's find the pieces together." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in her mailbox. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was elegant. Inside was a message from the Bedford Church Council. "Dear Miss Jennings, we have completed renovations at Willow Creek Chapel and plan to reopen with a small remembrance service on the anniversary of the tragedy. We would be honored if you joined us to light the first candle and say a few words, only if you're ready." Ella stared at the letter for a long time. She hadn't stepped foot inside that chapel since the shooting. Part of her believed it was cursed. Another part felt like if she entered again, she might collapse. But she also knew this might be her only chance to reclaim the memory, not to erase the horror, but to remember the love. The return to Willow Creek. On the day of the service, the chapel looked exactly the same, and completely different. The wooden pews had been refinished. A soft white cloth covered the altar. Stained glass windows had been restored with a new panel, a single dove flying through a violet sky. Beneath it, a plaque read, "In memory of lives lost and love never forgotten." Ella stood at the back for a moment, frozen. Then, with trembling hands, she stepped forward. Tara walked beside her. The candle sat on the altar, small and waiting. Ella lifted the lighter and touched the flame to the wick. A soft glow flickered, then steadied. Silence fell across the small crowd, just a few dozen people, many survivors themselves. Some wept, some closed their eyes. Ella took a breath. "I was supposed to say vows here," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "But I never got the chance. So today, I'll say this." She paused. "I loved a man named Nathan Hale. He was brave, kind, and he made my world feel safe. We didn't get forever, but we got enough to know it was real." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I light this candle not just for him, but for every person who's lost something precious, and for all of us still learning how to live again." She stepped back. The room remained silent, reverent. Then someone began to clap softly. Others joined in. It wasn't applause, it was acknowledgement. Ella smiled for the first time in weeks. Not a full smile, but a real one. Letting go, not forgetting. In the months that followed, Ella finally began contributing her voice to the survivor group. She never spoke for long, but her words struck deep. She began writing a memoir, not to publish, just for herself. She visited Nathan's grave more often, bringing fresh flowers and reading him pieces of her work. Max would sit quietly beside her, tail curled, listening. And one morning, she woke up to the sound of birds chirping and realized something startling. The ache was still there, but so was hope, a fragile, flickering kind of hope, not for a perfect future, but for a meaningful one. Final scene, the echo that remains. On the 2-year anniversary of the shooting, Ella returned to Willow Creek once more, this time to sit alone in the back pew. She wore a simple dress and held nothing but a small notebook. She opened it and whispered aloud a few lines she'd written days earlier. "Love doesn't end. It just echoes through every breath we take, through every sunrise we watch alone, through every brave step forward. Love remains, even when everything else falls away." And then she stood, placed a hand on the bench beside her, the place where Nathan should have been, and whispered, "Thank you for loving me." If you find this story interesting, please like, share, and subscribe for more crime stories.